Yes, let me say, first of all, that I'm really pleased and also honored to have the chance to be here. Thank you to Antonio, thank you to Flaminio for inviting me. I think the combination of ingredients that BEHAVE stands for, like computational modeling to understand how social behavior in a complex way aggregates up to things at the macro level, but at the same time look closely, empirically, with experiments in controlled ways, what goes on at the micro level, what are actually the processes that are at the basis of this aggregation. That is really a very important direction, a very promising direction in research. I can very much relate to that, so I'm very happy to be part of the opening of BEHAVE. And I hope I can show also how in this area this combination is very important as a future direction. So why are we interested in opinion dynamics at all? Well, probably it's not really needed to say a lot about that. I mean, we have seen in recent years examples where, let's say, collective opinion formation processes have resulted in very surprising things. Experts who look into this stuff got it all wrong with regard to the presidential elections in the US, with regard to Brexit, with regard to all sorts of ways how public opinion responds to political events, to changing social and economic circumstances, migration, and so on. And I'm absolutely not here to pretend that we, with our computational social science methods, could make much better predictions than those experts, but I believe these developments illustrate how difficult it is to understand this discrepancy between how people influence each other at the micro level, in social media, in their way, how they respond to media, and what happens in the collective dynamic of the formation of opinions as a whole. If you look into how social scientists often look at social influence, arguably the thing that really dominates the day is the idea of conformity. Mostly when people interact with each other, influence each other, this seems to be going on. Social influence often is defined as a tendency to change your opinion as to become more similar to the opinion of the people you interact with, and there are many reasons to think that this goes on, drawing on psychology, social psychology, experiments, conformity experiments, persuasion studies, and so on. So the whole picture seems to be if people have different opinions and they interact in the end, they will more or less have very similar opinions. Well, this is not what we see in society as a whole. There are plenty of examples where conformity or consensus is not the outcome of social influence processes. I take just this one example here, which is not to be taken too serious, but I encountered this on the website of The Economist, just liked it a lot. So the idea is you have different regions in France, and these regions seem to quite very much differ in the local norm as to how often you have to kiss an acquaintance if you meet the person the first time that day. So in some regions it's just one time, in other regions it's 5 times. And there is also here a pattern that we can characterize as local convergence and global diversity. So in certain local regions there seems to be a fairly high degree of homogeneity in what people see as the prevailing norm. And then there's a sharp boundary, and in another region there is another norm. And this seems to be a fairly stable pattern of diversity that does not go away just like that. So it's not, I think France is not converging, these data seem to suggest that, not converging to a uniform kissing norm very soon. Okay, a bit more of a serious example is, of course, political polarization. There has been much research done into describing empirically patterns of polarization. Actually, for a long time, there was a bit of a consensus, seemed to be a bit of consensus in the literature that despite all that talk about the American general public's more and more polarizing, actually we don't really see it in survey data, for example, or we only see it on certain issues or in certain time periods, but not as a long time robust trend. It seems that the tide is changing now a bit. There's this one interesting working paper by Mark Gensko from Stanford who used Pew data and looked in particular at the political opinions that people who describe themselves as politically engaged had in the US in these surveys, and constructed, let's say, one dimension from consistently liberal to consistently conservative based on many political items, sort of a principal component analysis approach, and then looked at how the distribution of positions along this scale between people who identified themselves as leaning to Democrats and people who identified themselves as leaning towards Republicans changed over time. And this seems to be a fairly clear pattern that if we compare these time points, we at least see definitely from here to there, a development towards a much larger division between these two subgroups in this sample. So a trend towards, let's say, society, or at least this group of politically engaged people increasingly falling apart into factions with increasingly opposed opinions. And again, of course, this is really not very consistent with this idea of if people interact, then on the whole, their opinions will become more similar to each other, because it would be quite a heroic assumption to assume that people who are here and people who are there never interact in any way. I mean, there is some exposure, at least via media, social media. You hear from each other, you meet people occasionally, also if they are not from your political leaning. So that has, for people who try to understand how micro-level social influence processes aggregate up to what happens at the macro level, been for a while a puzzle. I mean, here is a quote from 1964, social psychologist Abelson, psychologist, I believe, studying communities in the US and political opinion formation in these communities. He characterized the general pattern as something like a bimodal outcome of community cleavage studies, so pretty much like what we just saw in the most rightmost graph on the previous slide. That seems to be a prevalent pattern, and Abelson was coming from this idea: influence reduces differences, interaction reduces differences, and then what on earth must we assume to explain that this is the outcome? And somewhat later, Robert Axelrod started a quite influential paper with this observation that, well, if we assume this, that people become more alike if they interact in all sorts of ways, then why don't all differences eventually disappear? What's going on? So this has inspired quite a few people to look further and to try to model formally what is going on. But the earliest models, formal models, that try to describe complex, say, opinion formation dynamics in networks, large groups of people, were actually starting from this idea of what we call assimilative influence in a recent paper. So this is basically this. If people interact, they move towards each other in their opinions. And there are very many different ways how you can formalize this, how you can mathematically analyze these models, how you can simulate different versions of these models. But on the whole, if this is the driving micro-level process, then this is what happens. So in connected networks, at least if there are no subgroups which are totally disconnected from interactions with the rest of the population, in the long run, perfect consensus will be the outcome. And here's just one example of how that looks like if you look at the density distribution of the opinions over time, starting from more or less a uniform random distribution. Then after a while, you see that here the whole population more or less converges to the mean of the initial distribution. And of course, this can change if you assume different network structures and so on, but as long as the network remains connected, in the long run, consensus is the inevitable outcome. Now, this has set off a literature in which people started to think about, well, what else could be going on, and in particular, how could we perhaps describe different fundamental micro-level processes in a more broader theoretical framework, and so to say, stick them into models that we can then use to understand what would be the collective level consequences of those processes. And here's it's sort of a stylized formalization of this basic model that often is used, that we also use in much of our research. So let's say if someone interacts with people in his or her social environment, there is a tendency, if this is your opinion, this is the opinion of a person you interact with, to move towards the opinion of the person you interact with, to an extent that depends on a weighing factor, which can express things like how persuasive is that person, how much power difference is there between you and the other person, and so on. And a very, let's say, simple way to make this more complex and accommodate other behavioral theories about social influence is to see this no longer as something that always has to be a positive value. It can change over time, and it can also become negative, or it can become zero. If it becomes zero, it would mean there is no influence anymore. So for some reason, there are people, even if you interact with them, they don't have influence on you. If it becomes negative, it would mean if you interact with people, you may even want to distance yourself from their opinion for various reasons. So one can say, let's assume this is a function of the opinion distance between you and me, and of course we know we can stick into many more things that play a role, like for example, to which social group do you belong, and to which social group do I belong? Do you belong to the same ethnic group, religious group, and so on? Also that plays an important role, but the general idea would be this changes over time, is a function of you and me, and your and my opinion, and in particular our level of disagreement. And then one can think of different ways how to formalize this and how to describe this weight function. So here, for example, we would say the larger the disagreement becomes, the less influence you have on me. But the influence is still positive. And as long as we keep assuming that we still are in the range of, in the long run, we will all have the same opinion in the end. But you could also say, the larger the influence becomes, the less our disagreement becomes, the less influence you have on me, and at some point it will go to zero. This is what, for example, people use who use models called bounded confidence models, based on various theoretical foundations, for example, biased confirmation theory, assuming that you are rather willing to accept influence from someone who is more similar to you because you would think, for example, that person can be more trusted, or you just understand that person better, or you think this person is more in the same situation than I am, so his or her opinion is more relevant for me. Bias confirmation, so various theoretical ideas could underpin that, but that already leads to a very different dynamic, as I will show you in a minute. Or you could assume, if the disagreement between you and me exceeds a certain critical level, I start to see you as a person that is actually no longer, let's say, a positive referent for me, as psychologists used to call that, but becomes a negative referent. If you have this opinion, and we disagree already that much, or we are so different in many ways, then that actually means I should have an opinion which is different from yours, and maybe we should increase our opinion differently. Maybe I should move my opinion in the other direction because you are here on the spectrum. So there are many different ways to look at this, but what I mainly wanted to convey here, there is a way to describe this in one rather simple framework. And obviously this framework doesn't capture everything, but it can help us to look more closely into what could be interesting variations on the micro level and how would they relate to macro level outcomes. Here's just one example of what could happen. This is, let's say, the simple model where we combine two processes that we sometimes call assimilative and repulsive influence. There they are again. So assimilative meaning as long as we are not too divergent in our opinions, we would move closer together if we interact. Repulsive meaning if our distance is too large, we rather want to distance our opinions from each other. And over time, if you start here from a random uniform distribution, you would see that an outcome can be this, bipolarization. So some people are so distant from some other people that they start to move away from their opinions towards the extremes on an opinion scale, becoming increasingly extreme. But in the process, there are others who are still more moderate, but those others are still their friends and are pulled with them towards these extreme positions on the opinion scale. And that results in, under many conditions, in a bipolarization society falling apart, this artificial society here falling apart into two opposed camps with totally, with very extreme and totally opposed attitudes. And again, there are very many different ways how to model this dynamic, but on the whole, it would come down to more or less the same result under many conditions. One way to look at this from a, let's say, micro foundation perspective would be to see this as this micro level process as an expression of cognitive dissonance minimization, meaning that if I interact with someone who is very different from me or disagrees with me very much, I would see this as a negative source of influence. That this creates sort of a tension. I interact with this person, but we disagree very much. So I can start to negatively perceive this person, and then it becomes consistent with this negative perception to move away from this person's opinion. So this is a way how it often is justified to make this assumption. Minimization of cognitive dissonance. This is a rather extreme prediction, and of course we can make this more interesting and more telling if we look at, let's say, more complex settings. A very small step to make it a bit more complicated is to embed it into a spatial framework, which is what we did here for those of you who know these things. We adopted here a bit of the framework of Robert Axelrod's model of cultural dissemination and tweaked it a bit towards accommodating the micro-level process I was just describing. In addition, we used here so-called Voronoi diagrams to model the spatial structure. So this is a cellular framework, but the cells are not regularly shaped. Well, arguably for aesthetic reasons. I just like this picture better than regular cells, but also maybe because it's interesting to see how robust predictions are if you relax this regularity assumption. So here we start out from just a random distribution of attitudes. This is the attitude scale. And there are two extreme cases. Oh, you don't see the colors here, but the extremes are black and white. So in the beginning it's random. Then on the whole you see much assimilative influence indicated by this large green region here in the middle. So here in this green region, people mostly converge towards, let's say, a middle mean opinion given the initial distribution. But something strange is going on in those corners. And what actually happens there is that here are local concentrations, local disagreements. So people disagreeing strongly with their local neighbors. They also only interact with their local neighbors in this graph. But if you disagree strongly with your local neighbors in this model, that means that you start to move in the one extreme direction in the opinion scale, and your neighbor starts to move in the other direction. So you want to distance yourself from your neighbor, and your neighbor wants to distance herself or himself from your opinion. And then you see these places here where this happened. So there were here are some agents who by now have become black, meaning adopting the one extreme end of the spectrum, and everyone around them has become white, moving to the other end of the other extreme end of the spectrum. And we see here the mirror pattern going on in that corner. And because these people have moved now to the extremes, they pull their friends with them, as you see here and here. The friends, so to say, of the majority of those people here move in that direction. In the middle, we still have the moderate middle ground, so to say. But over time, the moderate middle ground becomes smaller and smaller. The center doesn't hold. And in the end, well, if you run this forever, so to say, probably you see only black and white left, but not in the computational time that we had at our disposal here. Oh, by the way, this is the wrong inference. It's from another paper, but don't worry. Okay, so we can see more complex pattern, more spatial patterns. We also can look what happens in such a spatial framework if we assume different micro-level processes. Here we use, again, base drawing on Axelrod's model of dissemination, cultural dissemination, but changing it somewhat. We use, again, such a spatial framework, and arguably this here the behavioral assumption is sort of a bounded confidence assumption. So as long as the neighbors you interact with are not disagreeing too much with you, you move towards their position, they move towards your position. But if the disagreement becomes too large, you reject their influence, meaning you just don't respond to it. You don't move away from it, you don't go towards it, you just ignore them. This is the starting situation. And if we now run the model, then this is what typically happens. You see a clustering process. So, say by random chance, in some regions of this spatial network, people agree a little bit more with each other than with their neighbors. That becomes self-reinforcing through these processes of assimilative influence. Thereby they differentiate increasingly from their neighbors up to the point that they don't respond to influences from their neighbors anymore. And then we have this stable clustering process. So if we, of course I could go on now a lot about different versions of models with different or more or less similar results. But I think if we put all this together, one conclusion we can draw is we have different micro-level assumptions, all of which seem more or less reasonable, are rooted also in experimental research, psychological research about social influence. But these can result in very different macro-level patterns of opinion dynamics. And the big question, of course, is what should we do? So we have these different micro-level processes, we have fundamentally different macro-level dynamics, how to go from here to there. And obviously there are many other factors involved, but in addition to just the micro-level processes, but this kind of theoretical work suggests, I believe, that we can no longer get away with just running these theoretical models, but we really have to go to the micro-level processes and to study them empirically and understand let's say, which mix of these processes we really see going on in social influence situation. At least this is the argument that we made recently with a number of people in a paper arguing that this whole social influence modeling business has to move towards a next frontier, which is really connecting the models much more to empirical research. So how can we do this? What strategies do we have? And I put the behave logo here because I believe this is really compatible and consistent with how behave looks at this issue. One thing is, obviously, we can create situations in the lab, in experiments, in which we have a very controlled social influence interaction, maybe between two individuals, where we can control and change and manipulate the conditions under which they interact, and then we can derive from these fundamental micro-level models predictions, which we can then try to test and in a way that helps us to differentiate between these models. And the other strategy is we can look at the macro level patterns that we really see empirically, and we can generate computational models trying to align them as much as possible with the empirical situation that we look at, for example, calibrating them in terms of how is the population composed, what was the distribution at some time point t, where we start from, how do social networks in this population at all look like, what are the structures of social networks, what is the spatial distribution, how people live, how different groups are distributed across space, and so on. And then run simulations with alternative combinations of micro-level assumptions and compare them to data we have very similar to what Matt was talking about. For example, if we have survey data, panel survey data that measure up to a certain time point how political opinions change, we can look how well can we, with which combination of model assumptions, explain what the next wave is going to look like. And that can help us, again, in addition to select between models. But I think it's already quite clear that we actually need both strategies at the same time, and we have to think about how they work together. And it's in the end a sort of a cyclic process in which we, on the one hand, look theoretically, on the other hand, look empirically, in which we look at the macro level and look at the micro level and combine these things and bring them together. This is at least the philosophy that we adopt in a project that recently started called To Realism, with 4 teams from 4 different countries, very much overlapping with the authors you saw on this review paper I just showed you. That's not coincidence, of course. We thought a lot while writing this review paper about how we would like to do this sort of research, and now we got, fortunately, the possibility to do this for a while. And this team really combines computational and empirical social scientists and psychologists and mathematicians and so on. So we hope we can get a step further in doing this kind of work. Let me, moving towards, let's say, the end of the presentation, give you a few examples of what kind of work I think we will be doing and should be doing more in the future to get ahead. Here's some of the stuff we have done in recent years. So looking at the micro level, trying to understand in experiments how these social influence processes actually happen. I give you one example from an experiment that we did with Karol Takac, who is also a well-known colleague here. So here the idea was we have individuals interacting in one-to-one situations in the lab. They are exposed. First of all, we measure their opinions on all sorts of issues. Then they are exposed to the opinions of someone they interact with. We try to formulate these opinions in such a way that they can be quantified. And then we see how their opinions change as a consequence of being exposed to someone else's opinion. And we manipulate conditions under which this happens. We do all sorts of things. In particular, we wanted to know, is there this repulsive influence? Are there traces of this repulsive influence? Psychologists in the 1950s found this in their experiments, but they were, I dare to say, a little less controlled than what we did here. So we tried also things to make people like each other less within what ethics allow. But we did things like let them play dictator games with each other, which typically make you less fond of each other. Tell them that the other one supported another football team than yours, truly, truthful information. Or that the other person has a very different stance on a salient moral issue. Or anonymous, of course, in the lab. But all this did not really lead to what one would expect based on this combination of assimilative and repulsive influence. If you look at it from a theoretical perspective, the data we have are a data where we have a lot of variation in the degree to which people initially disagree. And what we're interested in is how does their opinion then change. Positive would mean they move towards the opinion of the source. Negative would mean they move away. And they cannot possibly move further than the opinion scale, so that's why there is a natural bound. And now these different micro-level processes give us different ideas about what should happen. So if, for example, on the whole, you are assimilatively influenced by the other person, then the shift should be larger and in the direction of the other person to the extent that your initial disagreement was larger, because you have more room to come together. That's what this assimilative influence theory would predict. You could also assume that to the extent that you disagree more, you are less influenced, but it's still positive influence. Then one would get a nonlinear association between these variables. Or you could assume that at some point you start to become negatively influenced. So for low disagreements, you would still be positively influenced. At some point, the distance is so large that you are not influenced anymore, and then it becomes negative, and it's still moderated also by the extent to which you have room to shift away from each other or towards each other. That's why we get this wave-shaped pattern. So in this way, we developed predictions, and we ran the experiments and analyzed the data, and basically this came out. Assimilative influence seemed to rule the day. So there was really very little trace of repulsive influence, very little trace also of rejected influence, in the sense that if the distance becomes too large, you're not influenced anymore. Interestingly, if there was negative influence at all, or repulsive at all, it was rather here, on the side where people agreed a lot. There we found more of a trace that they would differentiate a bit from each other. But of course, there are also statistical issues. I see Matt frown. Right. This is interesting because there are also theories which suggest that people have this tendency to try to be a little bit unique, to try to not agree too much with others. So that would be rather in line with what we saw here. Now you can say, okay, this is very highly controlled lab situation, doesn't tell us a whole lot about what goes on in larger scale social influence processes. A colleague, collaborator of mine, Michael Maes, together with colleagues from ETH Zurich, developed for an experiment where this was drawn to a larger scale. So looking now at online news sites and social influence processes. There are these news sites where you see a news story and then you are asked to position yourself on the spectrum of opinions regarding the item discussed or the issue discussed in this news story. What they did is set up an experiment, online experiment, recruiting people on Amazon Turk for participation, pay them, in which they showed people the current distribution of opinions on a particular topic. This was the topic, should there be a female pilot quota? And then asking them, where would you position yourself? Should there be totally no quota, or should there be a 50% quota, or should there be something in between? And what they did was show people different initial distributions and thereby create different treatments. The initial distributions were not wrong, they were drawn from empirical data but selected differently. So if you saw, here you see different types of distributions they showed, for example here unimodal distributions, here baseline situation, or here bimodal distributions. And the question was then if someone, so what are the differences in the responses of people given the treatments? This was used to establish a baseline, so to get an idea where would people be if they were not influenced at all, and we created a predictive model based on that, and used the model then to assess the changes in opinions that occurred, so to say, behind the scenes when people had seen this distribution and then gave their vote next. A summary of what came out of this is given in this graph. So you will now see how the average displayed rating moves from here to there, telling us, the average displayed rating moves from here to there, distinguishing between these different treatments. And here you see a vector field indicating where did people move given their previous assessed opinion, depending on the experimental manipulation. And roughly, this is based on a regression model that was done on the basis of those data. Roughly what we see is there is a tendency always to move towards the average displayed rating that you see. And the larger you are away from it initially, the larger the move tends to be. So again, the tentative conclusion would be it's mainly a simulative influence of what's going on in the lab. Of course, this is not the end. There are many conditions, reasons why other forms of influence could occur that we did not properly look at in those experiments, which is because we wanted to have very controlled situations. So more work is definitely here needed. I will, given the time, spend very few words on the second strategy. This could be one way how to do it, and actually we are working on this at the moment. So you can take, say, information we have about the spatial distribution of ethnic groups, migrants versus non-migrants, for example. This is Amsterdam, I believe. And political issues related to that, voting for right-wing populism or not. And then run simulation models with different combinations of assumptions and try to predict how this would work out in terms of voting patterns, for example, because we have rather fine-grained information on polling stations all over the place in the Netherlands, and can try to link this to each other. Well, this is what I can say about it. We're still working on it. This is a project I did together with Thomas Feliciani, Italian postdoc who was in Groningen and is now in Dublin, but still working on this project. So we hope not too far in the future to have some concrete results from this line of research. To summarize, I think we need to work from different angles on this problem. We need theory-driven models. These models can, for example, tell us what are the really interesting things at the micro level to focus upon, the things that could matter for macrodynamics. We need experiments, we need surveys, we need online data to really pin down more precisely what's going on at the micro level. So here are the online data. And there are, of course, lots of complex problems involved that we need to work on at the same time. And I think that the behaved approach is an approach that we need to follow here. Let me end by thanking quite a few people who over the years have been involved in this research, and again, many of them are no strangers to you. Thank you very much for
Thank you very much, Andreas.
We can take some 5 minutes for questions, then no, I don't tell the lunch is outside, otherwise it's a disincentive for posing questions. So anyway.
Thank you, Andreas, for a great talk. I still wonder, Daniel Alexandrov, a sociologist from St. Petersburg, Russia. Why, I remember on Michael Macy's page, there was a run of maybe a model of opinion dynamics in terms of polarization, just with 2 coordinates. In most cases, it converged to equilibrium of 2 positions. But I remember that once in 10, there would be 3 positions. So my question is, why always you have the convergence to 2 opposite opinions out of random combination of features? Coffee and a specific football team, rather than 3.
I mean, one answer, or part of the answer is it depends, of course, on the space of possible positions you can take. If there are only 2 football teams, you have to make a choice. We have looked here at many examples where there's a continuum on which to adopt a position. But even then, we still see often this bipolarization. And one part of the answer to why it does happen there is, it again depends on the micro-level process. So if you assume a micro-level process in which these assimilative and repulsive influence dynamics kick in only if distances are either rather small or rather large, then there is a lot of room for, let's say, middle ground, in which you adopt a more or less moderate position and don't influence each other anymore to come closer to you or feel repulsed by their attitude. So it really depends on how exactly this micro-level process looks like, what happens.
Hi.
There's more to it. We can.
Hi, I'm Shai, first year PhD. I was wondering, looking at the micro-level processes, if you looked at, for example, borrowing from Kahneman's prospect theory, if that kind of looked at the weight that you put on negative versus positive things, if you explored if that has any influence on the kinds of polarization that would happen, for example.
Okay, that's an interesting link I haven't made yet. I would have to think about it. So the idea would be that there's something like loss aversion going on, making you inclined to not embrace a position of someone by whom you feel threatened to incur a loss if you follow that attitude.
Well, it's more that you had a straight line in terms of
okay.
But perhaps it could be like a curve. I think you showed it in one of the...
Yeah, there was a whole spectrum, and I think that's actually the main thing I would like to convey. In many of these theoretical models, very simple assumptions are made, like it's a linear relationship between disagreement and the influence weight, but empirically, likely it's more complex, at least under certain conditions. I mean, in our experiments, it didn't look very much more complex than that, but these were very simple control settings that we looked at.